Okay, so my first question is, how do you feel the organic food movement has obstructed or taken attention away from food justice efforts, like if at all?
Well, originally the organic movement was really concerned both with environmental conditions as well as the conditions of workers and producers. And so, if you go back to kind of late 1960s, early 1970s, there were strands of the organic movement that really were concerned with what was happening on the land. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a consumer-based movement necessarily. I mean, clearly that's shifted a lot in, the past 40 some odd years, 40, 50 years. And I think the organic movement now is primarily concerned with getting organic food into the mouths of eaters. And that primarily goes through a labeling process. So it's a market-based solution to a set of environmental and social problems within the food system. And so organic by labeling is fairly restrictive. Mm-hmm. So there might be more kind of capacious understandings of organic that are out there. But when it comes down to how people interact with that in the marketplace, it's usually through, in the U.S. context at least, USDA certified organic and a handful of other organic certifications, most of which don't have kind of clear commitments to the conditions of workers, or quite frankly to, in some cases, the markup that comes with organic food and the way in which access to those foods is stratified. Mm-hmm. So I would say the contemporary organic movement is relatively limited in terms of its justice commitments and its equity commitments. That said, I don't know that it directly obscures food justice work. I think that for a lot of food justice activists, for example, there is a strong commitment to organic food. Mm-hmm. And there's a desire to make the healthiest, most environmentally sustainably produced food accessible to everybody. So on the kind of food justice movement side of things, there are many, many efforts to grow food organically outside of the context of the kind of labeling scheme. Mm-hmm. And use quote-unquote organic practices that, while maybe not certified, might be at or above the level of, what the USDA is considering to be organic. So the whole organic thing is kind of a mess, quite frankly, and I find it as a bit of a red herring. Mm-hmm. So I think on the food justice side of things, I think there's the potential for organic advocates to be more explicit in their justice commitments and explain why organic has benefits to people, most importantly farmers and farm workers who are directly growing our food and are being exposed to less pesticides, for example, as a result of working on organic farms. And so I think that there's a much stronger story to be told about at least the occupational safety side of things. And there's a lot more room, I think, for organic advocates to be improving their own supply chains. Mm-hmm. And taking the workers that are working at each part of the chain seriously, and quite frankly to integrate more fair trade type commitments. Mm-hmm. And then that would, in my view, bring that a bit more in line with kind of food justice commitments. But yeah, I mean, there's ways in which organic obscures food justice simply because it doesn't pay attention to it. But I don't think that means that food justice movements they're not hampered per se, but they're not necessarily helped.
Yeah. So along that lines, my second question is, do you think that reforming organic certification requirements to explicitly regulate things like fair labor and wages could be a structural way of furthering food justice efforts, since the organic certification is such a big movement and push within the market?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I could see that having an enormous impact, simply because, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the share of organic food in the typical grocery store has grown incredibly,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the past several decades. And so, you know, we know people are buying more and more organically labeled food,
Mm-hmm.
and the label does have some sort of power in the marketplace. And so, you know, there is the potential to, I guess, revise the organic standards
Mm-hmm.
to include questions of labor, for example, or, you know, there could be other things perhaps.
Yeah.
So yeah, in theory, you know, that could be a mechanism to encourage more high road farming practices, high road processing standards, and so on, to ensure that, you know, it's not just the environmental conditions that we're concerned about, but it's also the human and labor conditions.
Definitely.
So yeah, I mean, in theory, that's totally one approach. And yeah, the degree to which there's sort of the political will to do so, I'm not totally sure, because
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the perennial problems is that even on organic farms, just because something's organic doesn't mean that workers are treated well.
No,
They may be
definitely
exposed to less pesticides, but in terms of like wages, workplace democracy, benefits, you know, overtime pay, a lot of different things, workers aren't necessarily in a better off place. And so the reason for that is because farmers are opposed to better labor practices.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the reasons people are getting into organic to begin with is to make more money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are people that are environmental champions and they want to like do right by the environment, and, you know, not to take away from people who do that, but there's a huge economic incentive too if you're at the right scale in order to then transition your farm, for instance, to organic production practices. So, you know, there's a lot of work that would need to be done on the part of convincing growers that improving labor standards is better for everybody, and that they actually have an ethical obligation to do so. And there could be an economic what's the word I'm looking for? Like a selfish economic reason for why growers might adopt organic standards to include better labor conditions, if then they're able to also charge more in the marketplace. So, you know, that would likely be passed on to consumers on some level.
Definitely.
And then there's the issue of, you know, do certain kinds of foods become increasingly out of reach for the average consumer? And that's another question.
Yeah, that's from my research, that's been like the biggest barrier when like talking to farmers about implementing actual like regulations through the certification for labor improvements, was that most of the time they just said like, we still don't make enough profit to commit to paying our workers that much money. Which is just like, I think that's the hard thing, is that like, because it's still operating in the like capitalist market realm, like profit is people's number one concern, and like even for more high market value products like organic, it's still such a vulnerable economic space to be operating in, that like most farmers with good intent are like, I can't make an actual commitment to that because I can't guarantee that I'm going to have enough money every season to pay what's like a so-called like livable wage. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. My next question, which I know we talked about this in class, but just for people who aren't in the food justice class, I was wondering if you could give a little insight into class-based food preferences and how that's reflected in the organic food movement.
Yeah, so food has always been a representation of class, rich or poor. You know, food reflects our values, and it reflects our means. And so, you know, if we're talking about what we might call like the cultural capital of consuming organic food, you know, that there's a certain amount of cultural capital that you have and that you can gain through showing that through your purchases in the marketplace that you value, say, the environment, or you value particular kind of land management practices or certain kinds of food. And so yeah, classes, we can see kind of class distinction, as Bourdieu called it, through taste.
Mm-hmm.
And taste-making practices are something that always change. And I think of, for example, certain kinds of like boutique grocery stores or markets, and the idea that you can, and it's and like the class distinction is really to show what you're purchasing to other people in your class.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of the idea of like keeping up with the Joneses.
Mm-hmm.
And so organic food, while not 100% like that, clearly has found itself in that sort of distinction-making arena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For people with greater means.
Mm-hmm.
But it also reflects other things too, like there's a lot of research on gender where, there's a bunch of research on mothers who purchase food for their children, and part of the distinction there is the distinction among mothers with those that sort of are more able to take care of their families through healthier food and those that can't, and that intersects with economic class too, but there's ways in which these practices are also gendered.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just depending on like who you are and the reason why you're purchasing organic
mm-hmm.
food for your family. And it's not to say that people of lower economic means don't want or don't care or don't buy organic food, but there's a way in which organic has become culturally coded.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you ask the average person what they think about, or who do they picture when they picture who buys organic produce, you're likely going to get a response that people buying organic foods are wealthier and they're whiter.
Mm-hmm.
It's likely to be the response. And so, yeah, class plays really closely into consumption patterns, and both like who has the money, but also why is it they're doing that.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that sort of feeds into, because from what I've experienced and seen, I feel like organic food has like that ethical consumerism like quality to it, of like people not only reflect their like class distinctions through the purchasing of organic food, but they also sort of, there's a narrative of having like a moral high ground because you're making these supposedly more ethical or better consumer choices. And I feel like the organic and health food movement has sort of taken on this like moral superiority, when like, yes, it has environmental benefits, but to some degree it's more just the distinction of being organic and the reflection that has within like your consumer practices and how it makes either like a consumer or the people around you feel about your consumer choices more than like the actual impact that it has on the environment or like benefiting labor or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that does happen. There's a moralizing that can be behind the purchase of quote-unquote ethical products.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think that absolutely happens, and the question of what's ethical is a whole other question, but yeah, there can be superiority around that, and the irony of that all is that if people operate from the assumption that purchasing something makes them better, or that is the quote-unquote better choice, what does it mean when people are structurally limited to making those choices?
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, then there's sort of a false choice that people have, because it's not fair for everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions in that, and it gets back to kind of the questions of food justice too, and like, what are the commitments of organic advocates? Who is organic for? And is there a commitment, for example, to economic justice so that everybody can purchase organic food? Or will it just remain a class distinguished practice that somebody can feel good about while turning up their noses to people who are poor?
Yeah. So then my last question, which sort of is along those lines, is just, do you think that it's possible for the organic movement to be equitable?
Sure.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, in theory. In theory, I think anything is possible. It's just sort of a matter of like political will. It's a matter of whether or not there are organized forces within organic spaces who care about these things. In my experience, I have found that there's a bifurcation among different segments of the food movement. And there are those segments that historically have been much more committed to environmental issues, and that continues to be the case, and the organic movement is a prime example of this. And quite frankly, so is the local food movement, so is a lot of movements around farmers markets and CSAs. Almost all of that is about environmentalism, and to some degree maybe community support. So there's always been this bifurcation between like that segment of the food movement and then the people-oriented segment of the food movement that cares a lot about social justice and economic justice and racial justice. And sometimes there's crossover, but oftentimes it remains like really divided. And so whether or not organics can adopt a more justice-oriented kind of framework, there are moments in time when that's been made possible. I think like during the last wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of institutions were forced to grapple with these deeper questions, and I think sought on like at least procedural grounds to try to, and representational grounds to try to change things a bit. But on a structural level, yeah, I think a lot of, well, I won't say that. But I think like the organic movement has a lot of work to do on kind of the equity side of things. Mm-hmm. And it could, for instance, adopt more of a domestic fair trade framework, mm-hmm. And integrate that into like a more holistic set of practices. Because I guess that's the thing I think a lot about too is, the labeling of organic is relatively limited in scope.
Yeah, it is.
And so the vision of organics is extremely limited in my mind when the set of conditions in the food system is vast. And so organics is not going to save us. Mm-hmm. Organics can't even save itself, I think.
Yeah. So
I think the question of justice is likely to come from other places and not from people in the organic movement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for answering all my questions. I really appreciate it.